The wagon wheel gave out with a crack like a rifle shot, and the world tilted sideways with it. Nathaniel Bracket was down off the seat before the wagon had even finished settling, already at the mare's head, already seeing the trouble. The front axle split clean through, and in the tangle of it the mare had wrenched her leg badly enough that she stood trembling, holding it up off the ground, refusing to put weight on it no matter how gently he coaxed her. "Easy, easy, girl." His hands ran down the foreleg, feeling for a break and finding, instead, something that might only be a bad strain. Though out here, in country this far from anywhere, the difference hardly mattered. She couldn't pull, not tonight, maybe not for days. The light was already turning long and gold through the pines, the kind of light that meant less time than it looked like it meant. That was the trouble with evenings in timber country. They didn't fade so much as get swallowed, the trees eating the sun a little at a time until a man could no longer tell which direction he'd come from. "Nathaniel?" Delia's voice, careful, controlled, the voice she used when she was not going to let herself fall apart in front of their son. She stood beside the broken wagon with their whole life roped down under canvas, doing arithmetic he could see moving behind her eyes. What little money they carried. How far the nearest town still was. How a family was supposed to start over on a handful of dollars and a wagon that couldn't roll. He didn't have an answer for her. That was the worst part. Not the wheel, not the money, not even the mare's ruined leg. It was standing in a stranger's forest with the dark coming on and nothing to offer his wife but silence. Behind them, Eli laughed. It came from near the tree line, bright and unbothered, belonging to some other evening entirely. Not this one, not this family stranded and afraid. Their son crouched in the pine duff, tossing a stick for their dog Rusty, who bounded after it with his whole body, tail going like a shutter in a windstorm, gloriously indifferent to broken axles and empty pockets and the failing light. Eli laughed again, that clean, careless sound children make before the world has taught them what there is to be afraid of. Delia watched her son play as though nothing at all had gone wrong, and something in her face cracked open. Not quite a smile, not quite tears, something caught between the two that Nathaniel understood better than words could have said it. That was when the dog went still. Rusty froze mid-stride, stick forgotten, ears up, a low sound building in his chest that wasn't quite a growl. A second later, something answered it from the shadows between the trees. Not a threat, but a question. One dog speaking to another, and out of the dusk came an old hound, gray-muzzled, moving with the unhurried certainty of an animal that knew every root and rise of this ground by heart. "Sam, easy." A man's voice, calm, following the dog out of the trees. He came forward slow, hands loose at his sides, a rifle broken open over one arm in a way that read more like habit than threat, the posture of a man announcing himself, not stalking anyone. Tall, weathered, somewhere past 40, a beard going gray at the edges, the same as his dog's muzzle. His eyes moved over the wreck of the wagon, the trembling mare, Delia's white face, and then, last of all, found Eli, still laughing, still tossing the stick as if the whole world hadn't just gone sideways around him. Something shifted behind the stranger's eyes. Something old, carefully kept down, gone again almost before it surfaced. When he spoke, his voice had softened, though he couldn't have said why himself. "Name's Reuben Hollis." He nodded at the wagon, the mare, the whole ruin of the evening. "Looks like you folks have had a rough go of it." Nathaniel found his voice, rougher than he meant it. "Wheels broke clean through. Mare can't walk on that leg. We were bound for the land office in town, but—" He stopped. There wasn't a way to finish that sentence that didn't sound like defeat. Reuben glanced up at what was left of the light, judging it the way a man judges something he's spent a lifetime reading. "You won't make town tonight. Won't make it tomorrow either, not with her leg like that." He hesitated, his gaze drifting back once more to Eli, who had finally noticed the newcomers and gone still, one hand resting on Rusty's back while the two dogs circled each other in cautious introduction. "Got a cabin a mile on. Ain't much, but it's got a roof, and I shot more meat today than one man and a dog can finish alone. He said it plain, the way a man states a fact rather than offers charity. You're welcome to it tonight. Delia's eyes found Nathaniel's, the same silent question that had passed between them for 200 miles now, and for the first time in longer than either of them could say, something in her face eased. We'd be grateful, Nathaniel said. Reuben only nodded, like the matter had never needed discussing at all, and whistled low for Sam. The old dog fell in at his heel without a backward glance, though Rusty trotted along at Eli's side the whole way, as if he'd already decided this stranger's dog was a friend worth keeping. Supper was venison, rich with fat, cooked over a hearth that smelled of wood smoke and years of use. Delia laid out what dried bread and preserves they still carried, small as the offering was, and Reuben accepted it without comment, the way a man accepts a gift he understands the weight of. Sam settled by the fire with his chin on his paws, one eye on Eli, who had already fallen half asleep against Rusty's side before the meal was through. It was only after the plates were cleared, the fire burned down to something low and steady, that the talk turned to what had brought a family this far from anywhere with almost nothing to their name. Nathaniel told it plain. The land they'd worked 2 years to call their own. The company that had found a way to take it back. Some clerk's error. Some payment the record claimed had never come, though he'd made it himself, at the counter, with his own hand. The letter that arrived too fast to answer. The morning they'd been told to leave what they'd built and not come back. And now you're chasing what's left of it toward a land office you've never seen, Reuben said quietly. It wasn't a question. It's what's left to chase, Nathaniel said. Reuben was quiet a moment, turning something over behind his eyes. Mind if I ask how much you're carrying? Not for myself. He said it easy, but Nathaniel felt Delia go still beside him, the same wariness rising in her that had risen more than once these past weeks. The fear of a stranger too interested in what little they had left. Reuben caught it and didn't push. I've got a man I trade with in town who knows the land clerk. Knows what's really selling, not just what's posted on a notice. Thought I might ask him for you next time I'm down. But it's your business. You don't owe me an answer. It was Delia, in the end, who gave it. $85. A little change besides. Something in Reuben's face didn't change the way a swindler's might have. No flicker of interest, no quiet calculation. If anything, it went more careful, not less. That won't buy good ground, he said, gentle as he could make it. Might buy bad ground, and even bad ground takes money to break and seed and feed a family on till it gives anything back. He wasn't unkind saying it. He said it the way a man reports weather he has no power to change. Delia's hands went still in her lap. Nathaniel felt the last of his hopes settle somewhere low and heavy in his chest. Reuben let the silence sit before he spoke again, his eyes drifting to the corner where Eli slept between the two dogs, Rusty's tail thumping once, lazily, in his sleep. Something in Reuben's face had gone distant, unreadable, and when he spoke, his voice had changed too, quieter, like the words cost him something to say. If you've got nowhere else to go, he said slowly, you could stay here. He nodded toward the dark window, the shape of the forest beyond it. Ground out there's got everything a family needs except an easy winter. Timber, water, game, fruit enough if you know where to look. It's not an easy life, but it's a life. The two of them looked at each other, Nathaniel and Delia, that same silent conversation they'd been having for weeks now, and something in Reuben's plainness, in the way he'd asked for nothing and offered what he could without dressing it up as more, tipped the scale. We'd need to think it through proper, Nathaniel said. Not tonight, but thank you for saying it. Reuben only nodded, like that answer was enough for now, and didn't press for more. It was Delia who asked the question that had been sitting behind both their eyes since the doorway. Mr. Hollis, if you don't mind my asking, why is it you live out here alone? A place like this, a man could build something bigger. a family even. Something crossed Reuben's face then, brief as a cloud shadow over a field, gone almost before it arrived. His hand found Sam's head without seeming to think about it, the way another man might reach for a pipe. "Reckon I just took a liking to quiet," he said. His eyes had drifted somewhere past the cabin walls, somewhere the firelight didn't reach. Man gets used to a thing after a while. It wasn't an answer, not really, and Nathaniel understood that. But he understood, too, that some doors weren't meant to open on the first night, and he let it lie. Outside, the cold was already settling in early, the kind that had nothing to do with the calendar and everything to do with the mountains at their backs. Nathaniel lay awake a while after the fire burned low, listening to his son breathe steady in the dark beside two sleeping dogs, and thought that for the first time in longer than he could remember, tomorrow didn't feel like something to dread. Nathaniel woke before dawn out of old habit and lay a moment listening to the unfamiliar cabin settle around him before he remembered where he was and why. Reuben was already up when Nathaniel came out, working a whetstone over a knife blade by the gray, early light. Sam stretched out at his feet. He didn't press about the offer from the night before, and Nathaniel was grateful for it. Some things needed daylight before a man could look at them honestly. "Mer'll need a week before she's fit to walk far," Reuben said without looking up. "2, maybe, if that strain's worse than it looks. You're welcome to stay that long, regardless of what you decide after." He said it like a fact, not a favor, and that was somehow what made it easy to accept. So they stayed. The days took on a shape neither of them had expected. Nathaniel spent the mornings tending the mare's leg, packing it with cool mud and rest the way Reuben showed him. In the afternoons, walking the timber with an eye he hadn't used in months, judging what could be built from what grew there, out of old habit more than any real plan. Delia took to walking the creek bottom and the rise above it, working her fingers into the soil the way she'd tested ground before, on land that didn't belong to them anymore, and saying little about what she found. It was on the 4th day that Reuben told them the rest of it, the part he hadn't said the first night. "This ground," he said, standing with them at the edge of a clearing where old stumps stood soft and gray with years. "More of it's mine than what I use. Filed on it proper, long time back. Meant to clear more of it once." He didn't finish that thought, and Nathaniel didn't ask him to. There was a stillness in the way Reuben said it that made clear the rest belonged to him alone, at least for now. By the end of the first week, a trader Reuben knew carried a letter down to town and back, a few blunt lines confirming what Reuben had already told them plain. $85 wouldn't buy land worth having, not with anything left over to break it, seed it, or feed a family until it gave something back. Nathaniel and Delia talked it through that night after Eli had gone to sleep between the two dogs. And this time, it wasn't hope driving the conversation. It was arithmetic. The soil Delia had tested with her own hands, the timber Nathaniel had walked and judged, the water that ran clean and close, but not too close, the way Reuben Hollis had asked for nothing since the night they'd arrived and offered plainly what he could. "He hasn't asked for a thing," Delia said quietly. "Not one thing." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "He hasn't." In the morning, they told Reuben they'd stay. Not as guests waiting out a mended leg, but as neighbors, meaning to build something of their own on the ground he'd offered them. Reuben only nodded, the way he had at the wagon, at the table, at every turn since. Like the matter required no more discussion than that. "I'll put it to paper next time I'm down to town," he said. "Witnessed proper, so there's no clerk anywhere who can tell you different." There was something harder under those words than the moment called for, and Nathaniel understood, without being told, exactly what kind of paper Reuben Hollis never wanted to see misused again. "There's work to do before the frost gets serious," Reuben added, already turning toward the trees. "Best we get to it." The clearing began within the week. Nathaniel took the axe to the smaller growth first, saplings, brush, anything a man could fell in an afternoon, while the larger hardwoods, the ones that would have taken days each to bring down and season properly, He girdled instead, cutting a ring through the bark deep enough to kill the tree slow, leaving it standing gray and leafless for a season or two until it could be dropped easy and split dry. Reuben showed him where to cut and how deep, an old trick from his own clearing years back. "Won't clear it all this year," Reuben said, watching Nathaniel work the axe into the base of a young oak. "No shame in that. Get your walls up, get your garden in, get through winter. Rest of it waits on you." They burned the brush in slow piles at the clearing's edge, and Delia raked the ash back into the thin soil where the garden would go, the way her mother had taught her a lifetime ago, on a different piece of ground entirely. A fence went up around that plot alone, not the whole clearing, just enough split rail to keep deer from the turnip greens, because there wasn't time or need for more than that yet. The cabin rose slow, log by log. Nathaniel set the foundation in fieldstone first, low courses to keep the timber off the damp ground, and from there the walls climbed in notched pine, the gaps between logs packed with clay dug from the creek bank and mixed with dry grass into a chinking that Reuben swore by. Pack it wet, let it dry slow, and it'd hold through the worst wind the mountains could throw at it. Nathaniel built the door himself, hung on iron hinges he'd forged crude but sound at Reuben's own small hearth, and fit it tight enough that no draft found its way through the seams. It wasn't fine work, it was honest work, and it stood plumb, and by the time the first hard frost silvered the grass some 5 weeks on, there was a roof over their heads that hadn't been given to them by any court's mercy. Reuben, in turn, found use for a man who knew wood and iron the way Nathaniel did. The trader's cart. Reuben used once a season to haul furs and cured hides, had a wheel gone soft on its rim, and Nathaniel spent an afternoon setting it right that Reuben admitted he'd been putting off for 2 years. It wasn't charity moving in one direction only. It was 2 men trading what each had, the way neighbors did in country too far from town to do it any other way. The horse was the trouble neither of them had spoken of at first, and the one that worried Nathaniel most, once the cabin walls were up and his mind had room to worry about anything beyond them. A horse ate through winter same as a man did, and there was no pasture cut, no barn built, nothing laid by. Reuben settled it plain enough one evening, the way he settled most things. "I cut hay most years anyway," he said. "Trade what I don't need to the timber camp east of here for flour and salt. This year, I'll keep what I'd have traded." He looked toward the meadow south of his own cabin, tall grass gone gold with the season. "Your mare can winter on that, and welcome to it." They cut it together through the back half of that first month, scythes swinging in the cool mornings, the hay raked into rows to dry, then forked up into a rough stack banked against the wind. Nathaniel built a lean-to against the south side of Reuben's own barn. Simple work, 3 walls and a slanted roof, enough to break the worst of the weather off the mare's back, without pretending to be more than what it was. It wouldn't hold against the deep cold alone, but paired with the hay and the shelter of the trees behind it, it would see her through. Delia, meanwhile, had turned every spare hour toward the garden plot, working against a calendar that gave her less patience than she'd have liked. Turnips went in first and thickest, sown the first week of August, while there was still time enough, 50, 60 days before the ground turned hard, and turnips could shrug off a light frost besides. A shorter row of mustard greens went in beside them, quick to eat and quicker to bolt if she waited too long. And along the fence line, in soil she'd worked soft with her own hands, she pressed in the sprouted eyes of potatoes she'd carried wrapped in a cloth sack the whole 200 miles. Not enough time left in the season for a full crop, she knew that better than anyone. But enough, maybe, for small, new potatoes, if the frost held off a little longer than usual. "It's a gamble," she admitted to Reuben one evening, kneeling in the dirt with soil under her nails. "Most things worth doing are," he said, and left it at that. Eli trailed after all of it, hauling water in a bucket too big for him, stacking kindling, learning from Reuben which berries along the tree line were safe to eat and which weren't worth the risk, no matter how sweet they looked. Sam and Rusty went everywhere the boy went, an easy pack of 3 now, and more than once Nathaniel caught Reuben watching the 3 of them from a distance with an expression that didn't quite belong to the moment in front of him. Something older, something he wasn't ready yet to name aloud. Before the last passable road closed under the season's first real snow, Nathaniel and Reuben rode into the trading post together. The little money Nathaniel had left spent down to nothing on flour, salt, dried beans, a sack of oats. Plain provisions, the kind no forest could grow no matter how carefully a man read it. By the time the wagon tracks froze solid into the mud, the clearing that had been standing timber 10 weeks before held a cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, a fenced garden gone green with turnip tops, a lean-to banked with hay, and a family standing in the doorway who had built every plank of it themselves. It wasn't a farm yet, not by any measure that counted standing timber or fields not yet turned, but it was no longer the wreck of a broken axle and a dying light either. And for the first time since the sheriff's letter, that felt like enough to build the rest on. The root cellar came next, dug into the dry rise behind the cabin where the ground sloped just enough to shed water. Nathaniel lined it with split logs, packed the walls with straw for warmth, and cut a shallow drainage channel along one side so no meltwater would pool where the turnips would sit through the cold months. It wasn't deep, and it wasn't fancy. A few feet down, a few feet across, roofed over with planks and a foot of packed earth, but it would keep through the worst of what winter meant to throw at it. The smokehouse went up smaller still, built from scrap boards and offcuts left over from the cabin, tucked close enough to the house that a man wouldn't have to fight weather to tend it. Reuben showed Nathaniel how to hang the meat high in a cache, well above where any hungry animal could reach, and how to keep the smoke low and slow rather than hot. The difference, he said, between meat that lasted the winter and meat that spoiled before Christmas. They set nets along a deep bend in the creek before the first skin of ice could close over it, pulling in what fish they could before the water sealed shut for the season, splitting and smoking what they caught alongside the venison. It wasn't much on its own, but stacked against the flour and beans from the trading post, the turnips already filling out in the row, and whatever the wood still had left to give, it started to look like enough. Not plenty, but enough. Delia spent the last warm days before the frost hardened for good out along the tree line with a basket on her arm, working through what Reuben pointed out to her. The high-bush cranberries that hung on past the first hard frost, sweeter for the cold that had touched them, and the last of the rose hips, clinging bright red to bare branches that would keep giving through the first snow if a person knew where to look. She boiled them down slow into preserves, jar after jar lined up along the cellar shelf. Not a way to fill a family's belly through winter, she understood that plainly, but something to brighten a hard month when everything else on the table had gone plain and gray. One evening, with the first real cold settling in for good, Reuben brought out a jug he'd kept corked since the fall before. Wine, rough and dark, made from wild grapes and elderberries gathered along the creek in better years. He poured it careful into 4 cups, one smaller than the rest for Eli, mixed thin with water at Delia's insistence, and for a while the cabin held nothing but firelight and quiet talk, and the easy warmth of people who had stopped being strangers to each other somewhere along the way. Sam lay stretched by the hearth with Rusty pressed against his flank, and Reuben, watching the 2 dogs settle together like they'd always belonged to the same house, said nothing at all. But something in his face, Nathaniel thought, had eased since the night they'd first met on the road. The evening before the first true snow came down out of a low gray sky, Reuben walked the fence line alone, the way he sometimes did at the day's end. Behind him stood a cabin with smoke rising steady from its chimney, a garden gone quiet under its rows of turnip greens, a lean-to banked deep with hay, a smokehouse holding what they'd need to see the cold months through. It wasn't a farm yet, he knew that plainly, knew there were still trees standing that would take another 2 summers to clear, knew the cleared ground was only a fraction of what this place could someday give. But it was no longer the quiet, empty stretch of timber it had been all those years he'd walked past it alone. The first snow came that night, soft and steady, and by morning, the whole clearing lay hushed and white beneath it. The fence rails capped, the smokehouse roof gone pale, the cabin windows glowing faint gold against the gray dawn. Winter had arrived, and for the first time in longer than Reuben cared to count, It did not feel like something he had to face by himself. Deep in January, the cold turned serious in a way that made even Reuben quiet. It began with rain, an odd, unseasonable thing, freezing as it fell, coating every branch and rail in a hard glaze of ice, before the temperature dropped again and the snow came on top of it, burying everything under a crust thick enough to walk on. The ice found its way into the root cellar through a seam in the plank roof Nathaniel hadn't thought to check, and by the time he noticed the damp patch spreading across the earth floor, 3 of the turnips nearest the wall had already gone soft and dark with rot. More following after them each day, the seep went unfixed. Worse, the trapline Reuben ran along the ridge to the north went silent under the same storm, buried so deep that checking it meant half a day's slow work through drifts that came up past the knee. And what he found when he finally reached it was mostly empty snares, the rabbits gone quiet and denned up against the cold, the same as everything else, with sense enough to hide from it. "Winter's running long this year," Reuben said one evening, standing over the root cellar with a lantern, doing the same math Nathaniel could see moving behind his eyes. 3 weeks longer than most, if the sky's telling the truth." He didn't say it like a complaint. He said it like a man reporting a debt that had come due sooner than expected. They took stock together that night by lamplight. Flour, beans, the last of the oats, what smoked venison and fish remained, the turnips that hadn't spoiled, the little that was left of Delia's preserves. It didn't take long to see the shape of the problem. They had enough, most likely, to see the family through to the thaw, but most likely left no room for 3 more weeks of hard cold on top of it, and there was no room left to gamble. Delia said nothing about the last 2 jars of rosehip preserve she'd set aside on the highest shelf, out of easy reach, meant for nothing more than keeping some brightness in Eli's diet through the leanest stretch. She simply moved them further back and didn't mention them again. It was Nathaniel who remembered the ravine. "South of the ridge," he said, laying it out by the fire. "Back in the fall, before the frost set hard, there was browse stripped off the young growth all along that slope, same height on every tree, like something had worked through there steady for weeks. Fixed stand of pine down in the bottom, too. Blocks the wind." He'd noticed it the way a woodsman noticed things, without quite knowing at the time why it mattered. "Dear'd winter somewhere like that, somewhere the snow doesn't pile as deep." Reuben studied him a long moment, something like respect settling into his face. "Could be." He glanced toward the door, toward the gray cold beyond it. "Worth a look, regardless of what else we've got left to try." They set out at first light, Reuben, Nathaniel, and Sam moving single file through timber gone silent and white, the old dog working ahead with his nose low, casting side to side the way he'd done 1,000 winters before this one. Reuben read the ground the way he always did, pointing out droppings still soft enough to mean recent passage, a scuff in the snow where something heavy had bedded down. Nathaniel, for his part, found himself reading the trees instead. The same stripped browse he remembered from autumn, a little higher up the slope than either of them expected, and beyond it, a natural break in the pines that would let a deer move down into shelter without fighting drifts the whole way. "There," he said, low, pointing to where the trees thinned into a natural corridor along the hillside. "They'd come down through there, out of the wind the whole way." Sam's ears went up before either man had finished speaking. The old dog's nose lifted, worked the air a moment, and then he was moving, certain now, following a line neither man could see but both trusted. They were close, close enough that Reuben had already begun to raise the rifle when the tree came down. It let go without warning, a 100-year pine bent low under a winter's worth of ice and snow, finally giving way all at once, cracking loud as a gunshot and dropping fast through the canopy with a sound like the whole forest tearing. Sam was directly beneath it, nose still down, oblivious. Nathaniel didn't think. He was moving before the sound had even finished registering, throwing himself against the old dog's flank and driving them both clear, the 2 of them tumbling hard into a drift as the trunk crashed down inches behind them, throwing up a cloud of snow and broken branches that hung in the air a long moment after the forest had gone still again. Sam scrambled up first, shaken but whole, and immediately began to bark. Not the low warning growl from the night they'd met on the road, but something higher, frantic, urgent in a way Nathaniel had never heard from the old dog before, aimed straight at Reuben across the clearing. Reuben went white. For one terrible second, he didn't move at all. Didn't seem to hear anything except a different sound, a different winter. Years gone and buried deep enough he'd stopped expecting it to surface. Sam young again, running full out through snow just like this, barking just like this. And Reuben too far away, always too far away, no matter how fast he'd run that day. Then his eyes found Nathaniel, sitting up in the snow with his face gone tight around a leg bent wrong beneath him, and the old winter let go of him all at once. He was across the clearing before Nathaniel could tell him not to bother, kneeling in the snow, hands already moving over the leg with the same careful urgency he'd have shown a wound of his own. Broken? Don't think so. Nathaniel's voice was tight but steady. Twisted bad. Maybe cracked. He tried to shift and thought better of it. Reuben didn't hesitate. He got an arm under Nathaniel's shoulder and hauled him up, taking most of his weight without being asked, and turned them both back toward the cabin without a single glance at the deer trail still open and waiting down the slope. "The deer," Nathaniel started. "Deer'll still be there tomorrow," Reuben said, and there was no room in his voice for argument. "You won't wait on me twice." Delia had the leg bound and packed with cool snowmelt by the time full dark came down, working with the same steady hands Nathaniel remembered from the morning the sheriff had come. Hands that didn't shake even when everything around them had gone wrong. Eli sat close by the hearth, quiet and watchful, one hand resting on Sam's back where the old dog had settled, unusually restless, refusing to leave Nathaniel's side. It was Reuben, sitting near the fire with his own hands still faintly trembling from the walk back, who finally spoke into the quiet. "Sam wasn't always mine to keep alone," he said, and something in his voice made both Bracket and Delia go still and listen. "Had a wife, Mary. A boy, Toby. He'd have been near your Eli's age, if things have gone different." He didn't look at either of them while he talked, his eyes fixed somewhere in the fire instead. "Winter, years back now. Flour ran low, and Mary took Toby down toward the trading post to see what we could barter for more. Regular road was blocked, big pine down across it, same as near put an end to you today. Funny how that works. So she took the shortcut, across the pond ice instead." His jaw worked a moment before he could go on. "Hadn't been but 2 warm days that week. Enough to soften ice that should have held solid clean through February. I didn't know she'd gone that way. Wouldn't have let her if I'd known." The fire popped low in the silence that followed. "Sam found me," he said finally. "Ran near 4 miles to where I'd set my line that day. Too far out, I know that now. Knew it before I ever got back, running the whole way and still not fast enough." He looked down at the old dog then, at Sam's head resting heavy against Nathaniel's good leg. "By the time I got there, it was already past anything I could fix." He let out a breath that had clearly been held for years. "Never blame Sam for it. Blame myself for setting that line so far from home. Told myself I'd never let the getting of food pull me that far from the people who needed me again." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Delia's hand found Nathaniel's, quiet and firm. "That's why you turned back today," Nathaniel said. "Not a question." "That's why," Reuben said simply. "Every time. From now on." He looked up, and for the first time since Nathaniel had known him, there was nothing guarded left in his face at all. "Deer'll keep. You wouldn't have." By morning, Nathaniel could sit up without wincing, the leg swollen but sound, no break in it after all. Delia had already decided he wasn't walking anywhere for a week regardless, and there was no arguing a decision made in that particular tone of voice. Reuben and Sam left before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, moving quiet back toward the southern slope. Back toward the trail, a fallen tree and a frightened dog had nearly cost them both. This time, there was no hesitation in the old dog's step, and none in Reuben's either. Only the steady, certain pace of a man who had, at long last, stopped running from the thing that had haunted him, and started walking toward what still needed doing instead. Reuben and Sam were gone the better part of 2 days. They came back on the evening of the second, moving slow up through the tree line with the last gray light behind them, and Nathaniel, propped by the cabin door on a crutch Delia had lashed together from a straight length of ash, felt something in his chest unclench at the sight of them before he could even make out what they carried. It was a buck. Full-grown, heavier than anything they'd taken all season, slung and dragged the last half-mile on a frame of lashed poles that had clearly cost both man and dog everything they had left to give. Reuben's face was gray with exhaustion, his hands raw with rope burn and cold. But there was something steady in the way he stood at the edge of the clearing, looking at the cabin, with its window glowing gold against the dusk, that hadn't been there the first night they'd met on the road. "Trapline held better on the way back," he said, when Delia pressed a cup of something hot into his hands. "Storm's done with the North Ridge. Caught 2 rabbits resetting the snares." He said it plain, the way he said most things, but Nathaniel understood well enough what it meant. Not a miracle, not a single stroke of luck undoing a whole winter's shortage, but the last piece settling into place beside everything else they'd already put by. The flour and beans from the trading post, the turnips still holding steady in the cellar, the smoked fish, the dried venison, the rabbits from a trapline finally clear of snow. A buck wasted at nothing. Meat portioned and hung, fat rendered down and saved, even the bones set to simmer slow into a broth that would stretch another week's worth of thin days into something a family could still call supper. It wasn't plenty. Nathaniel understood that as clearly as Reuben did, doling out portions by lamplight over the weeks that followed, watching the cellar shelves empty a little further each week with the careful arithmetic of people who had learned, the hard way, not to trust in more than what they could count. But it was enough to close the gap the ice storm and the long trapline silence had opened. Enough to see all of them. 2 families now, in every way but the paper Reuben still meant to file, through to the far side of the cold. The thaw came slow, the way it always did in that country. Not all at once, but a little at a time. The drifts along the fence line shrinking by inches before anyone quite trusted it wasn't a trick of one warm week followed by another hard freeze. Nathaniel's leg had mended enough by then to bear weight without the crutch, though he still favored it some mornings when the cold sat deep in the joint. The last of the turnips came up out of the cellar on a gray, mild afternoon in early spring. Not many, not much to look at after a winter in the dark, but enough for one more meal shared around Reuben's table before the ground itself would give them anything fresh again. Eli ate his without complaint, which Delia counted as its own kind of small victory after a winter of thin suppers. The next morning, Nathaniel and Eli walked out to the edge of the cleared ground with a hoe and a sack of seed Delia had kept dry and safe the whole winter through, and began breaking new soil at the tree line, where the girdled trees stood gray and ready now to come down. It was slow work, father and son together, turning earth that had sat wild and untouched since long before any of them had ever set foot on it. Ground Reuben had once meant to clear for a wife and a boy who never got the chance to see it planted. Reuben found them there past midday, come to help with the last of the heaviest roots, and stood a moment at the edge of the field before he picked up a mattock and got to work beside them. He didn't say much. He rarely did. But Nathaniel caught him, once, pausing mid-swing to watch Eli press seed into the turned soil with careful, serious hands. And whatever crossed Reuben's face in that moment, he let it stay there a long while before he went back to work. Sam and Rusty lay together in the new spring sun at the field's edge, inseparable now in the way old friends are, watching the work with the mild disinterest of animals who had already decided the outcome didn't much concern them. By evening, the first rows were in, turnip and bean and squash, the ground broken wider than it had been the autumn before, wider than it would need to be again come next spring, when there'd be that much less standing timber left between the cabin and the creek. It wasn't a farm. Not yet. Reuben stood at the fence line as the light went long and gold across the new turned earth. The same way he'd stood there the evening before the first snow, taking its measure honestly, rather than however he might have wished it to be. But it was no longer a stretch of forest he walked through alone, remembering. It was ground with a family standing on it, seeds pressed into soil he'd once cleared in his mind for people the winter had taken from him. And somehow, watching Nathaniel straighten from the row and Eli laugh at something Delia said from the cabin door, that felt less like losing something twice than like finally letting it live. He didn't eat alone that night, or any night after. And when the corn came up green that June, thin but steady along rows his own hands had helped to plant, Reuben Hollis walked the fence line at dusk the way he always had. Only now, more often than not, there was someone walking it with him.